Not that long ago, I had a conversation with my best friend, and I think by the end of the call, he thought I was nuts. But what I told him was to prepare for some very trying times and to prepare for the unrest that's going to be a result of these trying times. And I discussed the conspiracy to deindustrialize the United States and the very deep connections to the Masonic order orchestrating this, and others, secret societies that have been working for a long time to bring about a one world government. And I think he thought I was nuts. But I'm going to promote something called goldstandard2013.org. In September, they're going to be having a rally, and they're going to put a petition out to restore us to the gold standard. This plan is a long-term plan they've had. The elite bankers have engineered basically a totalitarian socialist takeover of America via regulations and now increasing police state activities. Homeland Security has purchased 2,700 tanks, 1.3 billion rounds of ammunition, 7,000 AR-15 rifles. I can go on and on. What are they preparing for? Well, what they're preparing for is the inevitable collapse of our economic system and the loss of the dollar. History is the greatest indicator of the future. Those who forget the past are doomed, or I should say condemned, to repeat it.
A new world order can emerge.
Auto sales are way up. Home sales at a record high. Business investment in equipment is growing at 7 times the rate of the previous 4 years.
Shares opened at $9 and jumped to $97 on its first day of trading.
I saw stocks go up 30 and 40 points a day.
If you don't get on this technology boom, you're going to just be left in the dust. You're going to miss the whole thing.
It means we use the mighty muscle of the federal government in combination with state and local governments to encourage owning your own home.
In this amazing world of instant global communications, the free and efficient movement of capital is helping to create the greatest prosperity in human history.
Real estate could be the key to your future.
The houses are selling like hotcakes.
Yeah, that makes 12 straight months of positive sales.
Houses with no money down, another house with no money down, 3 cars, 2 motorcycles, a boat, clothes, jewelry, vacations. It all came tumbling down.
This is an extraordinary period for America's economy. Over the past few weeks, many Americans have felt anxiety about their finances and their future. Credit markets have frozen. Major financial institutions have teetered on the edge of collapse, and some have failed.
The Dow traders are standing there watching in amazement, and I don't blame them.
It was the worst day on Wall Street.
Can't look at it after you buy it. It's so horrible.
The stock market is now down 21%.
This market is as volatile as you'll ever see.
I have never live looked at the Dow Jones Industrial Board and seen a 600-point loss. Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate.
This was 1 week, Maria. This market took 5 years to go higher. It's now down 40%.
We haven't seen anything like this probably since the Great Depression, I think it's fair to say.
Life, as most Americans know it, is about to change.
The impact of this recession is real, and it is everywhere.
We're in the last days of this country surviving.
This is not a recovery, it's merely a cover-up.
People are disgusted, people are upset, and yet all the news is sunny.
The economy is not recovering, it's getting sicker.
We are repeating the mistakes of the Great Depression.
We need to bring production back to America. There's not going to be a middle class in 10 years.
The class division is between the top 1% and everybody else.
CEO pay soars while workers' pay stalls.
Food inflation.
Gas goes up, milk goes up, trains go up. How am I supposed to live?
We're going to have a collapse much worse than 2008, but unfortunately, that's part of the cure. We have serious structural imbalances that need to be corrected.
In response to the nationwide decision by all U.S. banks to increase interest payments on all school loans to over 16%, students gathered today to burn their student loan documents in protest.
The Fed's decision last week to initiate QE6 sent commodity prices soaring, and as a direct result, we're seeing triple-digit inflation numbers in food.
China's largest credit rating agency downgrades U.S. Treasuries to junk status, and Moody's downgrades the U.S. Treasury yet again. On top of that, S&P warns of another downgrade of the U.S. dollar if debt ceiling isn't raised to $25 trillion.
I come back and they tell me you fired. And I'm saying, what for? I didn't do anything.
Walmart, the largest employer in America, just announced that they will be cutting 23% of their workforce. At the same time, the U.S. government is reporting an unemployment rate of higher than 14.3%, which is a 58% increase from last year's numbers.
For the first time in U.S. history, a Treasury auction fell short of buyers, causing rates to spike over 11% today, its largest increase in over a decade. Panic in the bond markets has ensued.
This morning, the Fed announced QE9 for $1.9 trillion, bringing the total stimulus for 2016 to $3.6 trillion.
They try to claim that the stimulus bill worked, and I just look at all of the polling data and no one believes it.
It's like a sugar fix, like a sugar high, fueled only by the Fed.
New numbers from the government today showed unemployment rising again.
Our national debt is now approaching $20 trillion, and the Federal Reserve just announced that we are unable to pay the interest on our debt.
Once an unthinkable event has now become a reality, and chaos has now broken out everywhere.
The future of our country doesn't have to look like that. The economic disease that is threatening to destroy our country is something that can no longer be ignored by any of us. Because the problem doesn't just affect a few people anymore. It affects every social class in America. However, there is a solution. But in order for it to work, you need to pay attention. Our economy, a complex creature that seems too sophisticated for many Americans to understand, is exactly how Wall Street and the financial elite want to keep it. The less you know, the more they get away with. And we don't have to look back too far from today to see it firsthand. If you remember the savings and loan scandal of the early 80s, which cost U.S. taxpayers over $124 billion, and at the time was viewed as an unthinkable amount to be used to bail out bankers who preyed upon innocent Americans, well, that figure pales in comparison to the financial crisis we just experienced. The economic collapse of 2008 was the worst since the Great Depression, and according to a new report from Better Markets, a pro-financial reform organization, the crisis cost Americans over $12.8 trillion. Tens of millions of Americans also lost their savings, their jobs, and their homes. The savings and loan crisis, which was infinitely smaller, resulted in thousands of executives going to jail for committing fraud against the American public. When trillions of dollars were lost as a direct result of the 2008 crisis, not one executive was sent to jail, and not one has been held accountable. Stan O'Neill, for example, the CEO of Merrill Lynch, which was on the brink of failure before it was acquired by Bank of America, received $90 million. After driving his firm into the ground, Merrill Lynch's board of directors allowed him to resign, and he collected $151 million in severance. O'Neill's successor, John Thain, was paid $87 million in 2007, and in December of 2008, 2 months after Merrill was bailed out by U.S. taxpayers, Thain and Merrill's board handed out billions in bonuses. In 2009, as unemployment hit its highest level in more than 17 years, Morgan Stanley paid its employees over $14 billion, and Goldman Sachs paid out over $16 billion. This gross display of greed, during a time when our country was experiencing the worst financial collapse since the Great Depression, goes to show you the arrogance these institutions maintain. They control our money supply, and now they control much of our government as the divide between Wall Street and Washington has all but gone away. It's a Wall Street government controlled by the biggest banking institutions in the world, and now, more than ever, they are making their own rules. A familiar face you may remember is a man named Henry Paulson, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, the biggest investment banking firm in the United States and one of the biggest contributors to the financial collapse. Mr. Paulson served as Goldman's CEO from 1999 to 2006 and was the highest paid on Wall Street. According to Forbes, his net worth has been estimated at over $700 million. On May 30th, 2006, Mr. Paulson became Treasury Secretary of the United States. By doing so, Paulson was forced to sell his $485 million of Goldman stock. But because of a law passed by the first President Bush, he didn't have to pay taxes on it, and it saved him over $50 million. This is just another example of how the divide between Wall Street and Washington has become non-existent, and as a result, some of the same banking institutions that created the 2008 collapse are now even bigger than they were before the crisis. So, what was it about the early 1970s that set us off on this perilous journey that is destroying everything our forefathers set out to create? For decades, our country's monetary system was based on what is called the gold standard. This helped our nation thrive during the Industrial Revolution and made us the center of economic power that we are today, even making the dollar the world's reserve currency. What a gold standard represented was that our money meant something. It wasn't just a piece of paper with some ink printed on it. Prior to 1971, the dollar was on the gold standard, which simply meant that every single dollar had a portion of gold stored at the U.S. Treasury. A dollar was essentially a gold certificate, or a claim on gold. Only a certain amount of money could be printed according to how much gold we had in reserves at the U.S. Treasury. What the gold standard accomplished was that it handcuffed politicians and bankers from printing as much money as they wanted. They actually needed to be disciplined in spending and borrowing, and the government couldn't run secret bailouts worth trillions of dollars. Because of this, the financial elite from around the world despised having the gold standard constrict their abilities to print as much money as they wanted. Gold was a fixed money supply, expanding with the economy at a very stable rate, but the bankers wanted a money supply that they controlled in order to increase their profits, loans payable to them, and debt that they could create out of thin air. By having the gold standard in place, it would be impossible for the people at the top to commit the type of fraud they have over the last 4 decades. If politicians wanted to spend too much money or go to war with money they didn't have, they couldn't. The gold standard gave us an honest money supply and a more disciplined government and banking sector. However, on August 15, 1971, due to pressures from the central banks and an expansion in government, President Nixon claimed he was going to temporarily suspend.
These criminals are notorious for this. The withholding tax, a temporary tax for World War II. Hey, how much withholding did they take out of your check last week?
Except in amount.
They're liars.
Determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
They led the American people to believe that the suspension of the gold standard was a temporary measure that Washington had to take, while fully understanding that this abolishment would be permanent and would change the future of America forever, for the benefit of only a few. From this point on, the dollar wasn't tied to gold anymore, and it became what is referred to as a floating currency or a fiat currency. Now, with nothing constraining its creation, our money supply exploded and all bets were off. Our currency was now prisoner to a few elite banking institutions that could create money as they deemed necessary.
Welcome to the New World Order.
Was the last hurdle for the financial elite to overcome. From here on out, the money poured in for the top 1% of our country and changed the course of America forever. This destroyed the value of our currency for the majority of us, while a small percentage made fortunes. This was the beginning of the extreme divide between the rich and the poor in our country. This historic increase in our money supply created the perception of a boom, but the living standards for the majority of Americans have collapsed, while those at the top have flourished. The destruction of our dollar is why it now takes 2 incomes just to support a family. As the government continues to expand the money supply, this scenario will only get worse for the majority of Americans. We need to restore the gold standard and put the handcuffs back on the politicians and elite bankers so this can never happen again. If we don't act now, the end result will be the collapse of the entire middle class and complete civil chaos.
Not that long ago, I had a conversation with my best friend, and I think by the end of the call, he thought I was nuts. But what I told him was to prepare for orchestrating this and others, secret societies that have been working for a long time to bring about a one world government. And I think he thought I was nuts. But I'm going to promote something called goldstandard2013.org. In some very trying times, and to prepare for the unrest that's going to be a result of these trying times. And I discussed the conspiracy to deindustrialize the United States and the very deep connections to the Masonic order. In September, they're going to be having a rally, and they're going to put a petition out to restore us to the gold standard. This plan is a long-term plan they've had. The elite bankers have engineered basically a totalitarian socialist takeover of America via regulations and now increasing police state activities. Homeland Security has purchased 2,700 tanks, 1.3 billion rounds of ammunition, 7,000 AR-15 rifles. I can go on and on. What are they preparing for? Well, what they're preparing